Ken Rolston. You may not know his name, but you've played his quests. Rolston was the lead designer of both Morrowind and Oblivion. On Morrowind, he was essentially given complete freedom and contributed to a huge amount of the world design, storytelling, and implementation. Essentially, without him, Morrowind wouldn't exist. With Oblivion, his role was not as large, but he still played a major role in the game's narrative, quest, and concept design that helped define Bethesda's open-world RPG experience. He was the one who sketched the general history and the lore of the different factions for both games, and helped provide a template for other writers. Prior to working at Bethesda, he contributed to award-winning tabletop RPGs like Paranoia and RuneQuest. With his huge passion for player freedom, a staple in typical tabletop RPGs, we saw this type of design implemented strongly in Morrowind and, to a lesser degree, Oblivion. When working with other writers, he was the one who provided them a template of such that they could follow and use as a guide. For example, he would provide Emil Pagliarulo a breakdown of the Dark Brotherhood, who they were, their history, the lore, and then he would provide a story template that needed to be accomplished, a certain amount of quests, a certain style of gameplay, different branching pathways based on decisions that the player made. He would provide the outline, the structure, and the sense of scope, and then allow the writers the freedom to experiment from there. He would leave Bethesda shortly after Oblivion and was not involved in any of their projects after that point, with him going on to work on other huge projects like Kingdoms of Amalur. Now, you might be listening to this and thinking that his role was quite minimal, but in this video I'm going to showcase to you how important it was. I will also show how right after his departure, Bethesda began to deviate from his principles and design, which as a result has led not just to a decline in narrative structure, but also a drop in quality in Bethesda's titles across the board. I will also answer the question, is Ken Rolston Bethesda's biggest loss? If you end up liking the video, please consider subscribing. Okay, so let's quickly summarize who Ken Rolston is. He began designing professionally in 1982, working on tabletop RPGs like Paranoia, RuneQuest, Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, and Dungeons & Dragons. He won the H.G. Wells Award in 1985 for Paranoia and served as RPG design lead at West End Games, Games Workshop, and Avalon Hill, helping define the RuneQuest renaissance of the early 90s. He later joined Bethesda and became the lead designer on the Elder Scrolls III Morrowind. Rolston's contributions to Morrowind were foundational. He shaped its core narrative, faction systems, and quest philosophy, setting it apart from other RPGs at that time. Drawing from his tabletop roots, he designed quests not as simple objectives, but as layered stories full of political intrigue, cultural depth, and moral ambiguity. His work brought Vvardenfell to life, an alien, ancient land filled with unique, competing factions like the Great Houses, the Tribunal Temple, and various guilds and cults, each with their own histories, values, and rivalries. Rolston emphasized exploration through dialogue, books, and player intuition, rather than map markers or linear paths. He rejected black and white morality, designing choices with complex consequences. Every step in the world felt earned, and every quest carried meaning. After Morrowind, he led development on Oblivion, where he expanded the Elder Scrolls formula with a more cinematic and accessible approach. He aimed to balance depth with mainstream appeal, widening the audience without dumbing it down. Rolston oversaw the game's major quest lines, including the Dark Brotherhood and the Thieves Guild, which are still praised for their storytelling and branching outcomes. He also helped implement the Radiant AI system, giving NPCs dynamic routines that made the world feel alive. Though some features were limited by new console hardware, his fingerprint is clear in the game's lore, its freedom of choice, and the faction-driven storytelling. Under his direction, Oblivion became both a critical and commercial success, laying the foundation of the modern open-world RPG. Now, I need to explain just how important his role was in these games, and I'm going to break it down into 3 sections: factions, quest design, and the writing, or lore. First of all, let's talk about the factions. Rolston was the individual who sketched out the factions, their backstory, and provided a general outline of what their quest lines would need to include. Certain quests, overall stories, and player freedom as well. In Morrowind, the factions weren't just quest hubs, they were richly written, politically complex organizations with conflicting ideologies. They had internal power struggles and narrative depth that made joining them feel like stepping into a world of intrigue and consequence. Each guild felt unique from one another, and joining them required different processes. How the guild's storylines played out, and which factions rose to power was determined by player choice. In Oblivion, the factions were a little more streamlined but equally as memorable, with the Dark Brotherhood, Thieves Guild, Fighters Guild, and Mages Guild. The Dark Brotherhood was about assassinating different targets and offered complete player freedom in how to take down your target. There were also multiple paths depending on whether the player completed the missions to a T or accomplished a task in a different way. It didn't fail the quest, just changed the direction. In the Mages Guild, you had to get a seal of approval from each guild hall across the map. As you completed quests in both games, you would move up the ranks and be given new titles. So, in summary, the guilds were all unique, had deep established lore, memorable stories, political intrigue, and offered complete player freedom. If you ask many Bethesda fans which games had the best factions, they will often reference Morrowind and Oblivion. Ken Rolston contributed majorly to this. And then we have the quest design and player freedom. As Ken Rolston came from a tabletop RPG background, his main focus was on player freedom. Games like Baldur's Gate 3 and Disco Elysium have mastered this setup, in that the player determines how the story plays out. If you wonder whether you can do something, chances are you can. The game reacts to everything you do, and rather than following a linear set story, the player forges their own. As a result of this design, every quest in Morrowind offered multiple ways of the player accomplishing the task and thinking outside the box. The player was often rewarded with unique dialogue or new objectives. Rolston wanted players to try and break the game. In Morrowind, for example, you could kill every major NPC in the game. It didn't result in a game over screen, but it just changed how things would play out. This is a true RPG setup and something that Rolston specialised in. Although Oblivion restricted some of these freedoms, it still offered a lot of it, especially when it came to the quest design. When Bethesda fans are asked which games had the best quests and offered the most player freedom for role-playing, they'll usually point to both Morrowind and Oblivion. Rolston contributed heavily to this. And finally, we have the writing. The best writing is often seen in games like Witcher 3, where the writers toe the morally grey line, like whether you want to save or kill the Bloody Baron. He's an alcoholic who beat his wife and drove his family away. But on the other hand, his wife cheated on him whilst he was away at war, where he developed PTSD and became reliant on alcohol in order to manage the stress of those events. Is he a good guy or a bad guy? Well, that's up to you, as it isn't just black and white, it's in the grey area. Morrowind thrived in this same place, presenting players with morally ambiguous choices, competing ideologies, and quests that rarely offered a clear right answer, forcing you to make the decision. In other words, it was deep and left an impression. Oblivion toned that down a bit, but still offered some memorable plot lines. The writing was not only deep, but included great humour, rich plot lines, and sometimes even dark or messed up moments which left an impression. No side quests in either Morrowind or Oblivion were generic copy-paste. They all had their own story. When Bethesda fans are asked which of the games have the best writing, they often point out Morrowind and Oblivion. Ken Rolston was a huge reason behind this. Quest and faction design, player freedom, and deep writing. These were Rolston's strong points. After he left, once Oblivion came out, Bethesda titles would start to see a decline in these three aspects, with factions losing personality, writing becoming more generic, and player freedom all but removed. I would argue that for every game Bethesda released after Oblivion and Rolston's departure, each would see a drop-off in quality, at least in regards to those three aspects. And the cracks began to show when Bethesda released their most successful game in 2011, Skyrim. Despite being a fan favourite for many, Rolston's departure began to leave its mark. See, when we look at Skyrim, I would argue it had the best open world, the best dungeon design, and the most sleek gameplay of any Bethesda game up until that point. It also offered player housing and customization. It's a great game for sure, but it also saw a huge decline in those 3 core elements I described before. Its 4 factions lacked variety, and their storylines were very short. All of them had a linear story, where there was no player freedom to change the outcome. The player would join the Mages Guild, complete 30 minutes worth of quests, then be appointed the headmaster of the school. Same with the Companions, where you became the leader, or the Dark Brotherhood, where you became the Whisperer and once again, the master of all. The quests really lacked variety as well, and they would end up with you in a Druga crypt. Need to kill a target for the Dark Brotherhood? They're in a crypt dungeon. Need to steal something for the Thieves Guild? They're in a crypt dungeon. Your first school field trip at the Mages Guild? A crypt dungeon. So the factions went from unique experiences, with each guild feeling different in terms of the quests and storylines it offered, which offered player freedom, to repetitive objectives with linear plot lines. You went from having to work your way up the ranks to becoming a leader in just 30 minutes. And the plot lines shifted from moral dilemmas to black and white straightforward setups. You were good guys, the others were enemies. The same pattern was repeated with Fallout 4, but this time the quest quality was not only shorter, but it was mainly focused on radiant quests that never ended and were generated by the computer. These same quests were the same that you were doing out in the open world anyway. You could be the leader of opposing guilds with no consequences. They did the same in Starfield, but without the established lore, they had to come up with their own factions, which resulted in space cowboys and space pirates. Essentially, the faction experiences in Morrowind and Oblivion were rich, distinct, and narratively complex, offering meaningful choices, political nuance, and a true sense of progression and identity. Whereas in Skyrim, Fallout 4, and Starfield, they felt shallow, mechanical, and repetitive. You knew that you were doing a Dark Brotherhood quest in Oblivion. In Skyrim, it just felt like every other quest. Bethesda still put factions in the game, but they didn't feel like them. They were just more linear quests to complete, which lacked in both story and world building. In Morrowind and Oblivion, the factions felt like 4 unique games all within one. In recent Bethesda titles, they feel the same and lack an identity to differentiate them from one another. Rolston's factions felt like real organizations with real goals. After he left, factions in Bethesda games just felt like hubs where you would receive generic quests from. And then we get to the player freedom and quest design. In Morrowind, there are no quest markers. You have to read dialogue and follow clues. This was a deliberate choice. Rolston wanted you to feel like a real adventurer, not just a player ticking off tasks. When they began to work on Oblivion, he acknowledged that the game had to be more structured to attract a wider audience and become more user-friendly, but he emphasized how important it was to keep player discovery at the forefront. Markers would point you in the general direction, but it would leave the rest to you. He also wanted players to feel freedom in how they approached a quest, offering multiple branching paths depending on your decisions. This would give players replay value and make them feel like their actions impacted the world. After Rolston departed, Bethesda began simplifying their game design. Less role-playing, little to no meaningful decisions to be made, and most importantly, the infamous quest marker. No longer did players need to read diaries, speak to NPCs, or figure things out, they just had to follow the marker. Morrowind and Oblivion had stories where the player was fed clues, leaving room for creativity and puzzle solving. Skyrim, Fallout 4, and Starfield just became follow the marker. Static objectives with no alternate paths. Follow the marker and do the thing. Or don't. That's it. An example would be how Oblivion will ask you to investigate a house. The marker will tell you to go into the house, but it won't tell you what to do once inside. For example, a haunting at the house in Anvil asks players to find out where a noise came from, but there's no marker. You have to search the environment carefully to find the clue. In Skyrim, Fallout 4, or Starfield, this same objective would have a quest marker pointing right at the clue. So a marker to get you in the house, then a marker to show you where the hidden clue is. No investigation required. It's right here. See? This not only ruins immersion, but it turns it into a situation where players don't even appreciate or look at the world they're in, because they only look at the compass at the top of the screen. This design may be more user-friendly, but it certainly isn't more exciting. If Rolston was still at the company, he would have opted for a Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 approach, where markers point you in the general direction, but still make sure that players have some work to do themselves. And remember in Morrowind how you could kill every NPC? Well, in Starfield and Fallout 4, you can't kill any. You have no freedom. The story was written this way, and you're going to follow it that way. No thinking outside the box anymore. Just follow the marker and obey the story that we've written for you. Don't try to roleplay as the bad guy. You are the guy that we wrote you to be. An example of this is in Morrowind, how you can kill any leader of a faction, which leads to consequences, such as fallouts with other factions or a change in the story. Whereas in Starfield, when the United Colonies officer asks you to work for him, well, you gotta work for him. If you try to attack him, he will not die and just remain crouched down until he heals. You're helping him, and that's it. This isn't your story, it's the story Bethesda wrote and you need to stick to it. See, Rolston prioritized player freedom and the ability to experiment, changing the game's world, whereas modern Bethesda have removed it entirely. And then we have the writing, which was simplified to such a basic level that it becomes almost cartoonish. You are the good guy and the enemies are the bad guys, just for the sake of being bad. Who should I align with? Oh, don't worry, we've decided for you. The good people won't shoot you, and the bad people will automatically open fire on you and become hostile. Skyrim had bandits, Fallout 4 had raiders, Starfield had spacers. These are the bad guys, and you cannot align with them, you can't speak to them, you can't reason with them. They have no purpose to exist other than to kill you and be general thugs. This isn't a grey area, this is black and white writing. In Skyrim, Fallout 4 and Starfield, the writing is so on the nose and offers no depth. Some of it seems like it was written for children and requires no thinking on the player's part. Follow the story the way Bethesda wrote it, do not deviate, follow the marker. Kill the people who are marked red, and that's it. Kellogg from Fallout 4 is a great example. He stole your kid and killed your spouse. You spend time tracking him down and get a dialogue option. Now prior to this conversation, he speaks to you over the intercom, explaining how he had to do it. When you finally meet him, you get 4 options which all amount to the same thing. You're going to kill him. This is the modern Bethesda way. They have decided the story for you. There is no player freedom and no grey area writing. Kellogg is bad because he is bad. You cannot reason with him or try to understand him. You can't sympathize with him or interrogate him. He's just a bad guy. You need to attack him, and it really feels like the player is expected to feel the way that the writing wants you to feel. They want you to be upset. I have done other videos on Bethesda's poor writing, but in summary, Bethesda's writing changed over time. Morrowind and Oblivion tackled politics, religion, and philosophy. Skyrim, Fallout 4 and Starfield offer comic book level villains and objectives designed for simplicity. Ken Rolston really focused on having these deep complex stories, with morally grey dilemmas, and he would let the player decide what was right or wrong. After he left, the stories became more linear, and you just had to follow what was written in front of you, with no options to deviate, whilst also seeing a decline in writing quality across the board at Bethesda. So, to sort of summarise everything, Ken Rolston was an integral addition to Bethesda's team. He was almost single-handedly responsible for Morrowind's world and quest design, which really put Bethesda on the map. Prior to his arrival, after releasing Elder Scrolls 1 and 2, Bethesda were close to having to shut down completely. After joining and making Morrowind, he changed their trajectory, and Bethesda established themselves and their formula with Morrowind. He then played a major role in the sequel Oblivion, helping give writers like Emil Pagliarulo good structures to follow, helping make sure Oblivion was more modern and user-friendly, yet made sure that it did not lose its identity that was established with Morrowind, focused on player freedom. That's why after the Oblivion remaster came out, so many people say, oh, this game's still better than modern games, or better than modern Bethesda, because it stuck to Rolston's principles. After he left, Bethesda would try to replicate his former by having factions with quest lines, side quests, and making the worlds feel alive, but unfortunately they would strip away a lot of the core features that Rolston emphasized, like player freedom, exploration, and well-written narratives. As Bethesda transitioned from offering open-world role-playing games to more linear action-orientated worlds where player freedom and experimentation was replaced with linear plotlines and quest markers, the reviews began to decline. Skyrim succeeded because of its beautiful open world, but it did have to carry a lot of the weaker aspects. Fallout 4 drew a mixed reception, and Starfield was the moment that everything came crashing down. With no established lore, Bethesda could only try to copy the template set down by former employees like Ken Rolston, but despite it appearing to be the same on the surface, it couldn't be more different when you do look deeper. Ken Rolston was not just an integral member of Bethesda's rise with his contributions to Morrowind and Oblivion, but he's also a huge reason for their recent decline. His principles and experience in tabletop RPGs was integral to Bethesda's open world design, and they veered from that after he left. And this is particularly sad when you realize how much these player freedom RPG games are more popular now than they've ever been, when you consider Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 or Baldur's Gate 3. Gamers now crave the Bethesda formula of old, the one that he established. When people tend to complain about the modern Bethesda, it tends to be due to the company's weak writing, lack of player freedom, and boring quest design. Essentially, they're weak at everything that Rolston was strong in. Once he and his ideals were removed, the quality began to slip, and many fans begged Bethesda to return to their old ways. I don't think that it's too much of an outlandish statement to make when I say that Ken Rolston was possibly Bethesda's biggest loss. When you think about everything that modern Bethesda is missing, when you write them all down on a piece of paper, chances are it's everything that Rolston implemented. It is for all these reasons I feel Ken Rolston is Bethesda's biggest loss. But anyway, that's it for this one, but what do you guys think? Do you feel Ken Rolston was Bethesda's biggest loss? Do you feel there have been bigger losses that I haven't mentioned? And do you think Bethesda should return to the formula that he originally provided? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoyed the video, please give it the thumbs up. And if you're new here, please consider subscribing. I'm Av Gaming, where we do video game analysis, identifying what makes great games great and what could make good games great as well. Thanks for watching. Av out.